Every child had their upbringing amidst the teaching of the gods. Deities that had lived in memory for so long and worshipped by the ancient ancestors, one could not doubt their credibility. Yet old to the degree one started to wonder what such an amount of time does to memory. Tales were told less intensely about the ancient home of the gods, that they had come to grace the old Thumerian people. This part was speculated and carried many different interpretations among the clerics and preachers. Theologists mostly agreed that it was most likely that the faith had its roots in an ancient civilization. If said civilization was called Thumeru and was situated underground was debatable, but made for fantastic stories that took on many shapes depending on the teller. Much like many other children, Master Willem had grown up with this in mind, but had along the way strayed from tradition. For unspecified reasons, he had intently focused on confirming the existence, nature, and worship of the Thumerians. His ambition and fervor in this pursuit made it appear as if he knew the answer but had no evidence of it. As many considered the old labyrinth a pure myth, Willem accepted nothing else than that they were real, and on top of that, having curious beliefs in regards to their deities. He did not recognize the current pantheon as a true one, only as images or creations of something that was once true. But perhaps it was this conviction that let him crusade into the topic with such haste and success. But he was a scholar and needed proof. Lawrence had for a time exclusively dedicated his time to sort through every known and recorded mention of the old civilization. What was pure fantasy? What was speculation? And what could create a narrative that would prove the most logical? Within one of the reading rooms of the lecture building, he laid down the note on the table in front of his master. Queen Yharnam. What do we have on her? He slid it back and forth over the table, indecisively hovering over their loose timeline. The tabletop was by no means organized into a readable line of apparent marked events, but more akin to a bundle of notes and hastily scribbled papers placed in a speculative order on the wooden surface. Willem and Luna examined it.
She could merely be a figurehead, a recent creation for a fitting origin.
Luna speculated. Willem flipped through the pages of his notebook, muttering Yharnam, Yharnam under his breath. No, the name is recorded in old Canehurst tales, much older than the county. Additionally, other regions also have tales similar to the local ones. Then the nobles, where did they get the name from? Willem removed the rounded spectacles he had for reading. Well, the nobles have long considered themselves of Thumerian descent. Yharnam could be one of their ancestors and, perhaps, even a queen. Lawrence placed the note, bearing the text, Yharnam, Queen, ? In the middle of the timeline. But can we link the name to Thumeru at least? They questioningly stared at each other until Willem nodded. Yes. Luna. He pointed over to a stack of books, almost reaching the ceiling. A red tome. Old Bloodlines by someone. Would you fetch it? She stumbled over and began to search the many volumes touching on the subject. Alright, back to the end. Lawrence tapped with his finger on the only empty spot on the table, situated at the end of their layout. It bothers me still that there are no recorded findings of the Meru. Until now, we don't know that yet for certain. Willem waved dismissively. But you're right. It creates the conclusion that they indeed were subterranean. In light of what was briefly encountered down there, could they still be alive and active, with no records of any encounters? The ancient migrated from the east and never encountered any of them. A stimulating question. A really good question. With no good answer, unfortunately. They both stared at the collage, while Luna returned, book in hand.
They have plenty of names of supposed ancestors. Yarnam is indeed referenced as a queen in a line of many queens. The author paralleled this cultural note with the fact that they have persisted with keeping a queen as the primary ruling head.
So indeed a queen. Also confirming a matriarchy within the Meru. Good. Is there more on Yarnam? She glared through the page, flipped to another and another.
They make clear distinction that, despite carrying the town's name, she is most likely a separate figure to the Healing Mother, but not much else.
Lawrence sighed. With that many queens, the Queen Yarnam is more likely a myth. A creation made up of several lesser queens to embody one single. Possibly most referring to the one dubbing the city or the likes. Willem remained unmoved by the objection. Eventually he moved his hand to fiddle with Yarnam's note and nodded slightly to himself. Then he hovered with his hand over the empty space at the table's end. The mystery. It all confirms a greater interference. An invasion? Plague, perhaps? The Great Ones. Excuse me? There is really no better term. The gods, if you will. Likely being that they are the real origin of our own pantheon. The source of this mystery. The Great Ones? Well, it would make sense that a religion predates the Healing Mother. But would you count her amongst the Great Ones? No. She was likely just human, ascended to sainthood. He leaned over the table, both arms stiffly placed over its surface. He had remained sharply still after he had brought up the unconventional subject. Luna's eyes had drifted up from the book, and she now held it open in her hands, but her focus was on Willem. I mean the entities that started the line. The Great One's presence was in the Sumerian time. And that is where we will find their eldritch truth. Well, I honestly did not think it was so serious. Surprised? You'll see, Lawrence. There are no other places with such divine history. Can you name even one? I don't follow. What location that we know of has a past that grants it religious importance? And I mean truly, as a source of divinity. Is not Yharnam supposedly built on sacred ground? Because the royal pair deems it holy, claiming it the ancestral home. That does not make it holy. But Thumeru, none can confirm its ties, yet everyone insists in tales. That is where the gods did dwell. Every myth, legend, and doctrine all tell a story. Together, masquerading as fairy tales, they indicate to a single place. And every story, like a flower, has embellished and beautiful leaves and petals, but all are from a simple seed of truth.
But something happened,
Luna said, and Willem nodded. Indeed. Since there is no Thumeru today, nor any sensible presence of gods. Thus I name them Great Ones, the beings that did exist on such a higher level that they were deemed gods by us. But again, something happened. Lawrence, he respectfully called out, and the man turned around in the lecture building corridor. Ah, Gammon, thought you were in the forest. We ended early. Oh, sounds unusual. Where are you headed? He smiled and held a large box a tiny bit higher in his grasp. Just leaving some material to the archive. Upon explaining, he turned and continued walking. German followed. Ah, is it on the Thumerians? It is. You know, you should send some of those guys over. If they ever feel sick of that course, they could easily tire themselves out by running back and forth like we do. I see. But are you making progress? They came onto the lower floor and turned directly left from the stairwell into a room filled with shelves behind a small reception desk. Oh, yes, we do. He fell silent, appearing focused on the shelves, but resorted to simply placing the box on the desk. Or, you know, it's just preparation for the real thing. German too looked at the shelves and did not face him, only nodding slowly. Where are we on that, by the way? Been a while since you talked about it. German turned and walked out, followed by Lawrence. To the right was the back door exit to the building, through which they exited out into the edge of the forest. Are they anxious to get moving? German asked while setting course towards his workshop. You mean the team? Not particularly. For now we have enough with what is already known. would not like to go in blind. They walked past his house and towards the lake edge. German stood by a tree and gazed out over the shimmering water. They are. My students, that is. Anxious. I can tell. They feel we are getting nowhere. But they are. They are improving incredibly well. Should they not? Seems to be a full house over there. You might not know, but it is hard to teach others. I can imagine. But if it is something you are passionate about, it should be easier. I thought the same. But it is hard, Lawrence. That's why I think so highly of them. There is a desire to improve, and even with my lack of techniques and strange methods, they learn to adapt. But they think little of themselves. How come you say that? They don't see what I and Maria sees. That they are growing into competent fighters. They only want to be through and get on to killing in the labyrinth. Seems understandable. German shook his head and turned to him. Have you spoken with Master Adrian? Lawrence looked surprised by the question. No. Why would I? Well, I suppose it is a bit much. But everyone seems to take my accounts dangerously lightly. Do you know where Adrian is now? Retired. And you can imagine why and in what state he must be in. Lawrence looked troubled, and he nodded once. German scoffed lightly to himself. I don't blame you for not thinking like me. You did not see them. And besides, Maria and I are in a morbid way used to them by now. So, no doubt even we speak more relaxed of them. What is bothering you, Gammon? You and the scholars can think whatever you like about them. In time you will see. But what will happen when my student sees? In a way, I wish I never saw. In his mind's eye, he saw how the foul, skeletal white bodies, walking irregularly, wielding daggers and spears in the cold halls of the labyrinth. How they fell before him and, groaning sickly and with immense exhaustion as they hit the stone. How there was no end to them. How they kept coming and forcing them out with their numbers. But the thing that within his mind's eye bothered him truly was their eyes. It could often be ignored, but once in a while he saw it very close and intimately. Perhaps it was just one monster that coincidentally struck him, or it was true to the implication. But the eyes had been alive. Alive with a soul and consciousness behind them, staring right into his own eyes and fixing upon him. A short moment of silent contact before it, like many others, fell to the stone. To take a life, Lawrence. Can you imagine it? I suppose not. But are you referring to them? Those monsters? I'm afraid of what will overcome them. What I will do to them once they delve below. I wish I never saw. Yet I will bring them there. To the horror. I was never ready. But they can be. But Gammon, there you have it. He met Lauren's eyes with curiosity. I mean, you are still here. You choose to go down there again. You cannot keep that from them. That is not what you are supposed to do for them. Sure, you can prepare them, but it sounds like you are just procrastinating, to put it crudely. German looked back, out over the lake. Maybe it's just me, Lawrence continued. But they need to see. Like you said, I will get my opportunity, but then you will be protecting me from the real danger. And then I can choose whether or not I can stomach the fear or let it take me. But first I must see. I must stare the fear in the eyes. You can never tell me about it, nor can you tell them. Perhaps you should have taken them on the very first day, like how it was for you. German continued to look out over the water, letting out a deep sigh. He turned to his lifelong friend. Thank you, Lawrence.
I am glad you could attend, Maria.
Luna expressed her joy towards her while walking out of the research chamber into the grand common hall. Being on the upper floor, the sound of the majority of foot traffic as seen below was somewhat distant, as heard from above.
I am surprised. You must have really kept up your readings.
The fellow student Berenger complimented as he hurried out after them.
I actually have. It is a most fascinating study.
Mayhaps it is even to some use in your other practice.
He likely meant the arduous training with German.
It might.
They walked out and stood next to the wooden railing, engrossed in the conversation, while students and teachers alike passed them by, in front and below.
Well, Maria?
Luna said mischievously and knowingly.
Has it been of use in the labyrinth?
Berenger's jaw dropped slightly at the notion.
Oh well, frankly not much. I honestly had little thoughts of other things than, well, surviving.
You mean you were in the labyrinth? Oh, how I wish I could see it. It would be such a joy to see them. The ancient dwellers, I mean.
I cannot share your enthusiasm, I'm afraid. But your opportunity will eventually come, once we are ready. Were you not afraid?
Luna cut in and was in turn received by a bothered smile.
A little, maybe. It is a peculiar type of fear that I find hard to describe, because it is also bizarre and unsightly. It cannot be rightly compared to any other fear. She's definitely scared.
Oh, I would be too. But it would be worth it, no?
It must be done. I understand many would want to examine their behavior, but for all your sakes, there will only be corpses left to examine.
Berengar appeared visibly intimidated by her implicated battle prowess, despite not having meant to stir such an impression, and he shrunk a bit before her own taller figure.
Of course. A shame. The state they're in, I mean.
Few have had the dreadful encounter, but you're one of the lucky few, hey Maria?
Luna persisted to meet everything and all with a cheery disposition, even what could count as grave matters. But it did have the curl of a smile come over Maria's expression.
Oh, woe is me. How delightful.
Berengar laughed slightly higher than they did.
Well, it has been pleasant, and we are all excited. I hope to see you before we descend into that dreadfully fascinating place.
He waved back casually as he walked away down the hall.
He likes you. That's what you think about everyone. It's true. Let's go. Lawrence is likely done by now.
They made their way along the railed edge of the upper floor towards the descending stairs.
Working hard with lore analysis as always. I do miss him in anthropology, but you know, like you, he has insisted on fulfilling this new project of his.
Envious of Master Willem? She giggled. Luna's brief, furrowed brow indicated there might be some truth to her jest, but she did not confirm nor deny.
I can barely keep their pace. Perhaps he's doing the right thing, but I find it exceedingly hard to halt my current projects. Oh, I'm torn, Maria.
They emerged down by the staircase as two loud elder scholars walked past.
I honestly thought you were only agreeing to assist so that you could be with Lawrence. Maria! You are well too young for such implications. But yes, it is a bonus.
The pair walked up to the door to the smaller room where the analytical workplace had been permanently established. Luna knocked and creaked open the door for only her head to peek inside.
Hello? All's good?
She opened up all the way. Master Willem stood by the door, his back turned and head faced back to her. With a bag in hand, it appeared as if he was in the process of leaving, but had been interrupted. German and Lawrence stood behind the table, with Carol sitting behind a large pile of books at the end. Luna, we were just finishing up. Was there something you wanted to add? Now that we are all still here. German and Lawrence shook their heads feverishly at her, unbeknownst to Willem.
No more work for me. Need time to rest up, don't you?
He nodded back towards the others before turning fully to her. I believe I do. But for the most part I am approached by new ideas as soon as I rest. Terribly bothersome at times, but stimulating. Let's see how this attempt fare, He greeted them both with a tilt of the head before exiting the room and vanishing down the grand hall. Lawrence fell back into a chair where he stretched himself out. German still appeared more vitalized as he remained to examine the surface of the chaotic table. I was ready for relief an hour ago. Oh, all luck you came to sway his tangent. Maria examined if there had been additions to the timeline. It would appear that much had been rearranged. A few things were as she remembered, but it was more or less a whole new variant of what she had previously beheld.
Each time I tell of our little expeditions, he always second-guesses himself with the timeline,
German said, looking over to her. Carol finally looked up from the book she had been writing in.
Now I hope it will stay this way. There is no proper documentation with this mess of notes on a table.
I will surely need to rewrite that. Lawrence yawned as he spoke.
I suspect I will, but hopefully it will be after the grand expedition. Gosh, there is so much of this.
Luna leaned over the table, looking fatigued merely from the recollection of their work.
There is something new every day, even if it is something small, and we have yet to delve down there.
Maria shared a grave and knowing look with German.
It's growing near. Tomorrow, they will see it for the first time.
The memory of the labyrinth was anything but pleasant. The things living down there would haunt her dreams for some time. Perhaps forever, and she could not make any light of their grim duty. If not the worry was for him and herself, it was definitely towards the apprentices. And even with their shared woes, it had to be done. The alternative was to leave it alone.
It is quite something to see German with his burial blade. A man in his element,
she remarked to lighten up the mood.
Take it from someone who has been in the midst of warriors. None really compare to his force of will. Do you have any stories, Lawrence? Or has he always been such a prodigy?
He smiled wide and rolled his eyes as he thought of a distant incident. He has always been a quiet prodigy. One time, when we were about, maybe 17 of age? Anyway, there was this lady friend of mine that had a particularly envious fellow. He could not stand us being together, and one day he arrived with 2 of his friends to show me exactly what he thought. Unfortunately for him, German was with us at the time. He leaned forward in his chair. German shook his head, looking rather embarrassed. As soon as the fellow grabbed my shoulder, German shoved his way between us. Lawrence smiled. He had likely told the story times before, and seemed to enjoy doing so. He completely ruined those guys. Gods was he fast, and boy could he take a beating. After it was all over and they all turned head over heels, I was actually worried for my own image as I saw how she looked at him.
Whoa! Holy!
Luna's head snapped towards German.
You never told! How does one become such a fighter?
German flashed a bothered glance to Lawrence before being forced to comment on the past events.
They had poor technique, and they did rough me up pretty decently as well.
Lawrence grinned and shook his head in disagreement. My friend here always downplays his achievements. There was a quick exchange between the old friends that Maria noticed in particular. She had long desired to know the source of this mystery, and briefly felt aggravated that Lawrence might potentially be privy to its answer. But she yielded, as there must be a reasonable answer, so must there be a reason for the fact he insists on avoiding the topic. She had enough respect for him to let his past lie where it was. German waited down the spiral as the group emerged from its stone slab steps. He regarded their appearance in the dim light of the candles as a rather intimidating group. All sporting their own variant of attire provided from clothes they had scrounged together themselves. Some had been terribly mismatched, but would eventually work into a fancy ensemble, fit for a warrior, wearing something ordinary under variants of overcoats, differing in length. Their protection was minimal and only present in some cases where it was the least mobility impeding, where some had taken to loosely reinforce areas such as arms or chest with plate. Others utilized hardened leather over their otherwise sturdy and practical clothing attire. They all stood inside the antechamber in silence for a moment, beyond which lay the beginning of the halls that German and Maria knew fairly well, but not so much what awaited them further beyond that. "Do you hear anything?" They all turned their heads around the room, and upon not answering him, indicating such was not the case.
"Listen. Carefully."
Only when one fell truly silent, the atmosphere of the labyrinth became more distinct. It was indeed at first perception very quiet, but there were irregular shifts in the tone of said quietude. It was near impossible to tell the source. It could be the sounds of footsteps that faintly and suddenly distinguished themselves. Sometimes a sound of a strained, whispered moan was heard. Sounds that could be a distant, monstrous scream. He saw on their faces that they had changed their previous opinion of the place, and could not help to smile wickedly.
"Strange, huh? Be wary."
He turned and walked to the archway and into the large chamber. He involuntarily looked upon the spot where Ginny had once laid. Since his first returnal, he had discovered that the body had vanished, which in turn birthed the habit of throwing a glance and a thought to that very haunting spot.
"Don't worry. This chamber is relatively safe, but keep your weapons ready."
The chamber was shaped in a square with alcoves on the four walls. It was much darker because of the width, that the few candles placed on the floor could not bring light to it all. Each of the arching recesses on the walls possessed its own portal, leading to further depths. One was barred, however, by a grate. Two observant statues of robed women held each a faintly glowing lantern at both sides of the sealed entry. He turned back to the group.
"Now we explore. Call it your graduation. We pick a direction and see what we find, and how we can handle ourselves.
You've been here before, Master? Millard wondered while throwing his glance over the ceiling.
Both I and Lady Maria have, and I know what you think. While one can memorize the terror, we learned that the denizens are treacherous and ever wander the halls. Perfect for training, incredibly annoying for continuous exploration.
Can you tell us of the Guardians, now that we are here? Vitus stepped forth and showed a slight display of eagerness. German had described his encounters before, but likely the reality of it all was only picturable while being in the belly of the beast, and they could only now fully receive the description.
What you need to concern yourself with is to treat them like humans. Do not become sloppy from their sluggish demeanor. They do not have any tricks up their sleeves, so to speak. They fight crudely and clumsily. But they are, as we know, of an infinite number and can overwhelm you easily. You have tactics and afterthought. They don't. Now, they exist in the ruins of their dead world. In a way, they deserve our pity.
Maria walked past the group with 2 torches in her hands. The room was mostly swathed in darkness, save for the light cast from the chamber behind them and the faint, dimly violet glow of the lanterns by the grate. She moved all the way up to the opening opposite them, where she placed one of the torches in an empty metal holder fixed to the wall.
Right. Now, we will all go down the explored path just to test your mettle. The path on the right is still unknown, and the barred one remains impassable.
He directed his hands to each entry as he spoke.
Ahead begins a corridor that later splits. So, since we will do so on the real expedition, we separate into 2 teams. I lead one, and Lady Maria the other. Millard, Vitus, and Cromley will join me. The rest will join Maria. Weapons ready?
They were all holding their preferred arms. He had instructed that bullets did little against them and had advised against such means. Some had, however, insisted and brought their own smaller pistols, to which he only thought it fitting to allow them to first-hand experience them futile. Before heading inside the darkened depth, he glanced over his shoulder.
We go in without light. When we scout, you want to have the edge on your prey and not to draw their attention.
They entered into a pitch-black corridor that curved to the left. There were barred fences along the masoned wall, behind which, and rowed along the wall, appeared what was most akin to tombstones. But their inscriptions were unreadable and their ancient purpose lost. The features were only distinguishable by the light of the previous room, but soon all was dark, and the pace of their feet grew slower. Having turned along the curved path, his eyes slowly grew accustomed to the oppressive black, revealing more of a curved ceiling, roots tangling over the stone-bricked wall, and the curious headstones. A tiny orb of light painted the floor, emerging from a second path leading down towards the right. Passing the new opening, It too curved off, but light could be seen laying over the floor in a cold impression from around the corner. German walked further ahead while Maria remained behind in the separating corridor.
I'll see you later,
she whispered to him while her party gathered alongside her, and he continued down the hall, followed by his group. Ahead lay an open doorway from which light emanated, like a window seen in a dark night where nothing seems to exist around. He stopped just where the light did not yet reach him.
Now here, there might be problems, so just listen to my command. Act only if I say so. Otherwise, stay behind me and defend. As soon as you have executed my command, return behind me. That clear?
They all confirmed in a unified ahum. The chamber was generously lit with a chandelier hanging in the ceiling over a large, open floor. 2 stairwells ran along both walls up to an elevated floor which was visible from where they entered. Along the wall between the 2 stairs was a walkway, halfly elevated between the ground floor and the upper level. From the dimmer reaches above emerged 2 figures coming down the stairs, one on each side, holding rakes or hoes of some kind. German threw a look down to his right to make sure no one was approaching in the corridor opening that was located just in the corner. It was empty, and he turned his attention back to the looming guardians.
Millard, Cromley, attack left. Vitus, take right.
He commanded low enough so only those in his vicinity heard it well. They flew past him towards their designated stairwells. The ghouls turned their way and sluggishly advanced towards them as a response. German stood at the ready, one hand on the hilt of his blade, resting at his belt. They had taken well to their training and each landed the first devastating blow on their opponents. As soon as he heard the heavy and somber sigh of pain from the labyrinth guardians, he leapt to the right, joining Vitus in his struggle. From the corner of his eye he witnessed how Millard retreated back with a quick jump, still facing his prey, and Cromley attacking in his place. Vitus darted around the shrouded and tattered garbed enigma, leaving German an opening to attack. He swiped firmly with his thick and curved blade with a blow so mighty it sent the lanky figure stumbling out on the open floor, but still holding its balance. Vitus then leapt after it, and the enemy was quick to turn its hooded head in his direction, while swiping back at him with a broad, horizontal cleave that had the lean man jump backwards evasively. German felt the sweat of his brow, making his brown hair stick to his skin. Alone, he had felt much more composed facing the horrors, but now he could not focus properly. Despite being near to assist Vitus, were the odds to turn against him, he still felt his heart racing for Cromley and Millard that were completely surrendered to their own skill, causing him to feel much more strained, as if having run in circles around the damp and cold halls. When he threw his eyes around to make sure they all did not succumb to a similar fear, he caught flickering shadows cast from beyond the corner doorway, previously empty, behind the combat-locked Vitus.
Move away!
He called out and moved into the enemy by spinning his body around, generating enough force that a blow he aimed at the creature in the middle of the floor sent it stumbling further back. Then he darted over to stand just beside the doorway. As soon as a body emerged in a similar, lumbering fashion, he swiped a downward cut at it. He glimpsed that there was one more still emerging from the corridor, who now had turned its wretched, hooded head towards him, blood depravedly pale under the bluish tatters that hung on its skeletal shape. The one ahead of its party slowly began to turn back by the sudden clash of metal against its flesh. With the force he committed into every attack, it was astonishing how almost casually they commonly reacted. Beside not cutting through the emaciated frames due to the tough nature of their bodies, they reacted slowly and with little alarmment. The notion of pain did not appear to afflict the creature that had been struck by a blow that would undoubtedly leave a deep gash in a human. The provocation managed to fully turn the creature towards him. He inflicted 3 more horizontal swipes, progressively higher on its body. One over the waist, next over the chest, and lastly at the throat, while backing towards the steps. During this, having separated the chunks in his cutter, Vitus suddenly came into view to barrage the one to German's right, with a cruel whip's crushing weight. Succumbing to the force of the metal weight, the pale humanoid in front of him let out a loud moan that bordered on a sigh and fell limply to the floor, causing the secondary figure to stumble backwards upon its companion being smashed into the stone. "Gammon!" He quickly looked to Millard, who had called out and now stared up the other's stairwell. He turned his gaze towards where he looked and saw the image of a terribly fat character with equally pale skin, but with a patchwork armor and crude club in his hand, beginning to descend the steps. He looked back just in time to catch the remaining figure swing at him with what resembled a garden spade. The distraction caused the metal implement to impact while he jumped aside. The blow was not comparable to human standards. Had he been more static and not moved along the flow of his force, the meekly spade might have cut deeper than it did. He was hit in the left ribs, and it firstly felt like they shattered from the pain. He stumbled backwards, throwing another glance up with frustration towards where he saw how Millard had managed to dart past the fat monstrosity, having just avoided a blow that scraped along the wall as he passed. Vitus had swung his whip club in such a fashion that the one who had struck German was now thrown into the wall, which caused German to turn and run up the steps. There he saw Millard landing a blow with his scythe on the sleek back of the creature, which seemed only to glance off it. It turned, revealing features exactly the same as the lesser ones. A bald head with 2 void eyes and a slacking mouth equally as dark. Millard paced before it while the club rose into the air and swung after him, which he nary avoided. German held a hand over the impacted area. He felt blood and intact ribs. He bit through the pain, brought the hilt of his curved blade up behind his back and into a mechanism that latched onto the hilt. A longer handle was folded out on his back that he grabbed with his left hand and swung the new contraption over his left shoulder and transitioned the same maneuver into an aimed swing from down left to upward right into the side of the fat mass. The reach of his transformed weapon now that of a scythe, carved its way diagonally from below the beginning of the chest area and ending over the beast's left bicep. It staggered and grunted in reaction, but did not look away from its initial target. German attempted to follow up his attack, but while he was about to spin the scythe over his shoulder, his entire side area tensed and ached incredibly upon raising his arm. He lurched forward, holding tight of his weapon and his wound. The creature swung again at Millard, who dodged out of the way, fear all over his face. Cromley entered the fray with an unfolded scythe that he cut downward into the creature's shoulder. It reacted about as much as from the previous blow. With the scythe now apparently lodged, he made the mistake to try and pull, during which the fat mass swung at him with his left hand that held a lantern. With all the momentum of the monster turning towards him and the flail-like lantern, the blow sent Cromley tumbling to the side, and he released his weapon. German started to recover back to his feet when Millard called out to Cromley and stabbed at the creature's side. Still with the scythe embedded, it turned back to him. It started to drag the club in the ground in a charge uppercut. Before it was launched, a panicked Millard leapt backwards whilst he had taken hold of his pistol. Be it intentionally or a fear-induced misfire, the pistol went off and hit the creature. The reaction was stunning, yet predictable. The loud sound, bright flash of light, and the sudden impact had it almost dropping the club by sheer surprise. Millard shared in this astonishment, but was not as crippled by it. He folded out the scythe and swung forward at the beast. German managed to swing his own weapon without making effort on his left arm. Handling a scythe demanded large and free movements, especially in combat, but the window of confusion granted them both to quickly inflict numerous wounds, while it had no choice but to succumb to the bleeding cuts. The pale and greasy skin was eventually painted red, and it fell backwards with an echoing thump. German heaved forward in an attempt to master his wounds. He breathed loudly.
German!
He held out a hand, urging Miller to be quiet.
It happens. Cromley.
The boy's face froze in grave, fearful concern, and he turned back. Cromley had raised himself on his right arm, but seemed locked in pain. His face was contorted in struggle, and his left hand was laid over his stomach.
You all right?
He groaned and nodded haggardly.
Vitus, look and see if anyone else is coming.
German said just as Vitus came walking up. He immediately turned back and shakily ran down the stairs, having lingered horrified at the scene upstairs. He put the scythe down next to him and sat onto the cold stone floor with small tufts of moss growing between the cracks.
That looks...
Yeah, I know, but it will happen. Help Cromley up, would you?
The young man blinked and shook his head and immediately went over to his companion.
Is everything all right?
Just hurts like. Oh, nothing else.
Is something broken?
You tell me.
Where does it hurt?
Having been helped up to sit straight, He brought his right hand and indicated over his left arm. Millard hesitantly took hold of it and gently felt it up and down. I feel nothing. Does it hurt? Cromley made a deep sigh that raised his shoulders.
All right, kid. In the satchel. Take out the bandages.
Millard fumbled around with the latch and then made further efforts to properly grab hold of the roll of cloth.
Help me off with this. Tear it if you have to.
He threw off his tricone before fumbling to drag back the sleeve on his damaged arm. Upon trying to help him, Millard ended up tearing it at the seam to expose the wound.
Now, there's not much bleeding, so just close it up and suspend my arm like so.
He gestured proficiently with his free arm, sitting hunched over his lap in which his arm lay, while Millard mostly acted out what Cromley illustrated and what he was told to do. When Vitus finally came back up from the stairs, German motioned for him to come over.
Get over here. I need bandages.
Cromley managed to rummage around the satchel and threw a second roll his way. He unbuttoned his vest and pulled back the coat. Nothing did appear broken, but his skin had been scratched horribly. A large bloody patch where the skin had been peeled back under the clothes. He pressed the end of the cloth weave against his shoulder and reached with the rest towards Vitus.
Get this in order.
The young man shook off his nerves and knelt down to begin to tightly bind around his torso, over the wound.
Everything good? Not bleeding as much now. It will heal.
He nodded and tied the weave together. Once it was done, German leaned back and supported himself on his arms that he stretched out behind his back. It was somewhat strained, but doable.
Suppose we got off to a bad start.
Trying to meet their eyes, he found it hard. While they seemed lost in thought, focused on something imperceivable, they simultaneously appeared void as they stared out into nothingness.
It was extraordinary to see your trick weapon in action,
Vitus commented awkwardly.
I thought for a while it was strange, but was proven wrong. I understand. But circumstances made it feel right.
Circumstances?
Well, to take a life. Some would perhaps say it will be easy to take such a life, if you could call it that.
He waved over towards the pitiful heap of mass that once was the fat guardian of the labyrinth.
But it's alive all the same. It is sacred, and a terrifying thought that it can leave, never to return. Thus came the burial blade into existence. A final rite, if you will. Something for the departed.
They hardly seem alive, Millard stammered.
No, you're right. That's why giving death might be a good thing after all. But it does not change its nature, I'm afraid.
He took a moment to examine their faces. Plainly there was fear, worry and doubt. But when he met their eyes, the faces changed, and he thought to see a glimmer of their true spirit that would never yield.